Well, of course, we know that players in the local construction industry were recently found guilty of collusion and subsequently fined by the Competition Commission. In the edition of Finweek this week, contributor Gavin Symanowitz explains why the fines imposed on the offending parties aren't enough of a deterrent to prevent similar wrongdoings in the future. He proposes a more effective three-pronged approach that to encourage healthy competition. At the desk with me, Gavin Symanowitz, the founder of fraudcracker.com, Cynthia Schoeman, Managing Director of Ethics Monitor, and of course we've still got Jessica Hubbard and Thandi Sizwe Makluchana joining us at the desk. So Thandi Sizwe, I'll start off with you. We can get the perspective on the angle that Finweek chose to go with dealing with this story in South Africa, and certainly it's had everyone's emotions rocked. It's linked to World Cup projects amongst the other 140 projects I suppose it's been about. 1.46 billion rand is the fine that was imposed. But as I said, tell us about the angle you chose to go with.
Sam, I think South Africa is a nation that really unites when there's something to fight for, especially if it has something to do with money. And I suppose the construction cartel, corruption, collusion, whatever people call it comfortably, is one of those fights that we've all united to fight. And I suppose part of that fighting is coming up with ways of dealing with the culprits, as well as ensuring that such things don't happen again. And our contributor here, Dr. Gavin Symanowitz, also an expert in fighting corrupt business activities, put together this fantastic story that talks about what such behavior is doing to the society, and how simply throwing money at the problem makes these culprits not feel guilty for doing such things, and hence we have one collusive case or collusion case after the other. So I wanted to stimulate a debate, sort of a national debate, on how, one, we can deal with these culprits, and not only that, but also how do we ensure that this type of behavior is shunned and not repeated, and how do we ensure that people who were wronged or robbed are properly compensated for their losses. And we know that so many people would have lost a lot of money during that whole World Cup infrastructure building or build-up. Yeah, I mean, recently speaking to Chris Griffiths, who's the CEO of Anglo-American Platinum, and talking about the impact of reducing supply on the price, and all of a sudden he jumped out and said, oh no, that would be anti-competitive. We know what's happened in the construction sector. It shows the sensitivity of the top brass in South Africa to what's taken place. But Gavin, your argument is that this isn't enough, the way it's been constructed.
Yeah, Sam, the government was caught between a rock and a hard place, excuse the pun, with the construction industry. In that, obviously the government relies on the construction industry to a large extent to build the infrastructure that they need to create the jobs. And so it was very difficult to actually impose too harsh a penalty, because then they're actually going against their own objectives. But I think what they've done is almost on the opposite extreme, where they've treated the construction cartel with kid gloves and said, look, we're going to impose a fine because we know that anti-competitive behavior is wrong, but the size of that fine is, in most people's opinions, most critics' opinion, way too low. It's just a slap on the wrist. And that kind of sends a message to the rest of corporate South Africa to say, we don't really want you to collude, it's wrong, but if you do, then we're going to impose a fine, but it's not going to be too big, it's not going to be too harsh in terms of restricting your current ongoing operations. And as individuals, as directors, we're not going to prosecute you either. So the kind of penalties that are being imposed are not seen to be in line with the size of the transgression.
So you're also arguing the size of the fine wasn't good enough. I mean, Cynthia, your thoughts on the role of the Competition Commission fines, and basically, does a large enough fine, could that potentially then incentivize better behavior in South Africa?
Do you know, Samantha, the problem is that, as in fact Gavin's article captures so well, the fine in itself is not an effective deterrent. It has to be combined with something else. At the end of the day, you say, yeah, let's do a cost-benefit analysis, and you can work out whether the fine becomes affordable. But the issue here of the fine, yes, while one should protect the industry, we understand that it does present a somewhat of a dilemma. But the fact that there's no individual accountability, that there is not in fact a meaningful, if you want, sanction really has generated, as we've seen in the press, enormous outrage, and I think it's a direct reflection of the fact that this matter has not in fact got appropriate sanction.
Gavin had a great example of comparing the business sort of cost that was almost incorporated into the way you do business, similarly to how a guy rides an expensive car and incorporates the fines of driving too fast into, that's just what it costs to drive an expensive car in this country.
And I suppose if you're driving an expensive car, you would assume that you have enough money to pay expensive fines. And also, I think what is interesting, potentially not always the case, but what is interesting is the Freakonomics story that you chose to use at the beginning. So just to maybe just tell us why you chose to use that and just give us a little background.
All right, well, that's really, it was investigating the extent to which social norms can be converted into monetary norms. So the researchers said, well, imagine that you're a parent who's going to pick up their kids from creche in the afternoon. You feel bad about coming late to pick up your kids. Let's say it closes at 4 o'clock. If you arrive at 4:10, then you know that the staff at the creche are waiting for you. You know you feel bad about having to make them wait for you, and so you try to be on time. What they tried as an experiment is to say, instead of making it a social normal contract, let's actually impose a monetary fee. So say, if you come late to pick up your kids, it's going to be a 25 Rand penalty that you're going to pay. And the thinking is, if you impose a penalty, then it's going to drive behavior away from having to incur that penalty. In other words, there'll be less late pickups going forward. In fact, what the researchers found was exactly the opposite. They found that the late pickups increased. And what they said is it changed the environment that the parents were in. Instead of being a social norm or a contract that people felt bad about this behavior because it was impacting on other people, it now got converted into a monetary contract. They knew the price of the transgression. It was now, say, a 25 Rand penalty fee that they had to pay. And I think what's happening with collusion in the broader South African corporate industry is that you are effectively saying to companies, we don't want you to collude or be anti-competitive because it's wrong. But if you do, then this is what the price is going to be. And it's going to be
10% of turnover.
Well, not even 10%. They charge 3%, in fact, of the value of the contracts, which was way less than even 3% of the annual turnover. So it was a very reduced fee. It was almost like a 25 Rand penalty fee for being late to pick up your kids. And I think what's happened is they've converted the social normal contract of not being dishonest into a monetary one where companies know the price of collusion, and they can work it out whether the profits are enough to offset the cost of that. And if it is, then it's just good business practice to maximize profits for your shareholders. Excuse the pun.
Sorry, a quick question for Cynthia. When they calculate the cost, do you think they're taking into account the reputational cost? Because it's not a palpable cost, but there is one.
One would like to think so, Jessica, but the reality is we've seen in the press already that the companies that are on that list, and the few who have not yet admitted and they're still dealing with the Competition Commission, they're being awarded contracts. So yes, there are organizations and many sectors of the public that are outraged, and we would talk about reputation damage, but they're still getting the work. So of course there is a reputational damage aspect, but I don't think that has been as meaningful and has as much of an impact as we would wish it had.
I mean, I'm going to try and get into the mind of the colluder. Is it fair to say that when sitting in that boardroom together and trying to collude, is it fair that in their minds they calculate for us to make 10 rands? It'll cost us 2 rands. So let's go and do it, because we'll make the 10 rands and they will charge us 2 rands. So we'll still be left with a profit of 8 rands. Would that be how, they plan these things? Would that, the sort of, mindsets they would have?
I don't think they physically calculate it. I don't think they sit down and they work out with an Excel spreadsheet, the amount of profits they're getting and compare that against the potential fines, because there's a lot of unknowns. But I think what this sends the message is that when you are fined, I mean, effectively, if you look at the size of the fine relative to the size of the contracts, it's about 3% of the value of the contracts. Margins in the construction industry are about 3 to 5% over the last couple of years. So effectively, all they're losing is the profits that they made on the tenders that they were awarded. So you don't need a spreadsheet to work that out. You know that if you go in and collude with your competitors, and you are found out, then all you're going to do is lose the profits that you've generated on the business that you wrote.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Let's get into the approach that you're looking at right now. The first prong of it is finding dividends. And ultimately basically using dividends to extract the fine. And I think that's an interesting one because you're punishing shareholders there, who some of them would say we were very innocent in this. Why is that?
All right. Well, firstly, what they're doing at the moment is punishing shareholders, because what you're saying is you're paying a big fine now that's coming straight out of the company profits, which is directly affecting your current shareholders. What I'm saying is, and it hampers the current business operations, which is what the government is trying to avoid. What I'm saying is, instead of doing that to current shareholders, let's punish the future shareholders. So let's say all the future dividends that would have been paid by the company, and you force them to pay it in line with historic dividend yields, those will be used to whittle down a fine that has been imposed on as a penalty. And so for the next 3 years or 5 years or whatever it is, shareholders won't actually be receiving those dividends in their pockets. It'll be used to whittle down the fines, which will affect future shareholders, which will make that share much more unattractive at the moment, and will probably cause a lot of people to dump their shares in the company.
And
now.
that's ultimately how management would then suffer. What are your thoughts on that, Cynthia?
Well, I mean, certainly it would erode any possibility of sort of performance bonuses, and that, of course, is one of the issues one's also talking about, around saying the performance bonuses that were paid should in fact be refunded, so to speak, and certainly one shouldn't have benefited out of that. But people do, and we've seen in other industries that bonuses get paid in the most absurd circumstances. So I wouldn't be one to put up my hand and say I foresee no bonuses if this happened. Somehow there have been industries managed to sneak it in, no matter what it would appear.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of criminally trying some of these culprits, ultimately, who led the collusion, that's still a possibility. It's just who's going to take them to court, Gavin.
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of calls for people to be criminally prosecuted. I've heard one legal argument that actually they haven't transgressed any physical laws, and so it's going to be very difficult to criminally prosecute them and put them in jail, which is a pity, because I think that would probably send the strongest message to say, well, if you as an individual act on behalf of your company anti-competitively, then you as an individual will be punished and go to jail. And I don't think it's going to happen, but ideally it should.
Yeah. How much time do you think businesses spend on looking at anti-competitive laws? What constitutes being, anti-competitive? What constitutes colluding? How much cognizance do you think that top management in South Africa pays to that?
Do you know, Samantha, to take that beyond your question, companies are committing extraordinary amounts of time to the broad area of compliance with laws and rules and regulations, and actually there are a plethora of them that, I mean, you would easily find a compliance officer in an organization ahead of an ethics officer. And while that compliance is clearly an important aspect, coming from my perspective, I'm saying that that's not adequate. It's essential, but not adequate. And it's around saying what is happening to in fact shift the behavior beyond mere sort of tick box compliance. And that's certainly what I'm not seeing.
And whistleblowing, Gavin, you make a great suggestion about whistleblowing. I happened to have a conversation last night with a colleague, and we're talking about this very story of yours, and I mentioned your suggestion, but he came up with a very interesting thinking, and he says if you incentivize the whistleblower as much as you do, if we collude in this group here, and we think, oh my goodness, now we will be found out, so how about sending Jess to go and whistleblow? And from what Jess will get, we all collude again and we share in those profits.
Right, okay, so just to put some context behind that.
Yeah, so I suppose you have to explain what your solution was there.
All right, so the suggestion around whistleblowing was two-pronged as well. Firstly, you need to enable people to have a safe mechanism in order to report any kind of anti-competitive behavior without revealing their identity. That's really important.
And do we not have any mechanism like that
at the moment? Not really. At the moment, it's really telephone hotline type things where people phone in and they can act as if they're anonymous, but ultimately they know their voices are recorded, and so that's not really done. The system that we've developed, for example, is online and does protect that identity, but in general, it's not that well protected. And the second part of that is like you were saying, is we actually incentivize people with a monetary reward to report wrongdoing. So and there's precedent for this in the US with the Dodd-Frank law, where if people report violations that lead to a recovery, then they are paid a certain percentage of that recovery by the government. And I was suggesting that that could work in South Africa. Your point about people colluding with each other and then reporting on each other would work if there were no criminal sanctions. So what could happen is I'm going to report on you, now you're going to be found out and ultimately could be criminally prosecuted. Now you could argue, well, is it worth colluding with each other to earn a couple of 100,000 rand or whatever if we're all going to go to jail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there we go. The last prong of this is ring-fencing the fines ultimately, because what we do know is the fines go into government coffers. We don't know where that money goes. We don't know how much of it is efficiently used. So, I mean, do you think that we could ultimately have a ring-fencing and an efficient use and channeling of the fines in South Africa?
Well, that's a much bigger question. I mean, you know,
you're just posing that as a possible solution.
Yes, I mean that's a bigger question in terms of how our taxes are collected in general. There's a big call for our taxes, for example, with SANRAL, with the e-tolls, that it goes towards maintaining the roads, for example, or that certain amounts of our tax revenue goes towards education, etc., rather than just going into the National Revenue Fund, which is just a big pot which our government decides where it needs to go. So, I mean, ideally, we'd like to see some of that type of accountability where the penalties, because of wrongdoing, is used to address the victims who suffered as a result of that wrongdoing. I mean, I think that's the ultimate what everyone wants.
There was a nice example, I think, in the case of the bread price fixing scandal. You were suggesting that the penalties go to subsidizing the cost of bread. So it's really getting back to the man in the street.
Yeah,
exactly.
The last point, Cynthia. I mean, you work with this all the time. You look at right behavior, wrong behavior. What, in your experience, incentivizes people to do the right thing when they're running businesses?
I'd like to think there are a group who do the right behavior, do the right thing because they are personally committed to ethical behavior. But in general, we do need some further encouragement. And while sanctions, while penalties are part of it, we are generally not focusing nearly as enough attention on promoting ethical behavior. We're simply focusing on reducing unethical behavior. So for me, there's a huge role for industry bodies to be promoting ethical conduct and, as King 3 recommends, measure the ethical behavior.